We're going to turn to our guest of honor today, Mayor Michael Tubbs, again, the founder and chair of Mayors for a Guaranteed Income. He's also a special advisor to Governor Newsom in California on economic mobility and opportunity. And Mayor Tubbs, I just wanted to start by saying, Stockton and Harrisburg have been linked in the news for quite some time. When Stockton went bankrupt back in 2012, that was at the same time that the city of Harrisburg tried to file for bankruptcy. The approaches were a little bit different. In Pennsylvania, we weren't allowed to enter bankruptcy, and the state actually put the city in receivership, and there was a restructuring that occurred, a little different than what happened in Stockton, but we both sort of share that story of what it meant to sort of rebuild post bankruptcy. And then I wanted to mention this to our viewers here today. Just received the new book by Elizabeth Hinton. I'm going to show that to the camera a moment if you can zoom in on it. It's called America on Fire: The Untold History of Police Violence and Black Rebellions Since the 1960s. Elizabeth Hinton is professor of history and African American studies at Yale University. This book isn't out yet. It's actually coming out on the 18th. And we'll see if we can get her on the show for next week to talk a little bit about the book. But what's interesting about the book is that Stockton and Harrisburg are both case studies in an analysis of urban rioting, which occurred throughout the country in the late 60s, and really it was the precursors for a lot of the Black Lives Matter movement that we see today, and better called Urban Rebellions by Professor Hinton. And she talks about the history of over-policing and indeed police violence in both of our cities in a way which is very prescient for the present. And one of the lessons that can be drawn from the book is that if we want to see real change to systemic issues such as systemic racism and systemic or generational poverty, then we have to think big, and we have to come up with programs like the program that was piloted by you in Stockton, California, first in the nation, to establish a sort of universal basic income approach to ending poverty in your city. Now, this is something that we're considering in Harrisburg, more than considering. I want to move forward with it, and there's a lot that we can learn from the Stockton experiment, and there are many aspects of the study which have just been recently published, and we're fortunate that the University of Pennsylvania is actually sort of leading the charge in terms of the Center for Analysis of this. But we wanted to have you on, and let's just begin. Tell us about what you did in Stockton, how it worked, and why you decided to really put forth the first mayor-led program anywhere in the country. Welcome.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Mayor. Whenever you term out or retire, I see a TV show in your future. I learned so much just from the first 10 minutes of being on. And Dr. Hinton's a dear friend. I was talking to her yesterday.
Good.
I can't wait to read the book. And I'm so glad to hear that under your leadership, the city of Harrisburg has turned the page and is thriving and leading and doing so much better. So kudos to you and your team. In terms of the guaranteed income pilot we did in Stockton in 2017 when we announced, part of it was sort of how I think you govern, was looking at the data, was looking at the numbers and realizing that my biases or my ideas about how the world worked or why people were struggling may or may not be true. But what was true was that poverty was the root of all of our issues in Stockton. When we talk about educational attainment, when we talk about economic insecurity, when we talk about even crime and violence, at the root of all that was just the pernicious nature of poverty in the city, and the fact that it was systemic, the fact that it was generational, and the fact that it was about a third of our children were living in poverty in the city. And I would argue another third were just one paycheck away. So I did research and read and realized that Dr. King, before he was assassinated, talked about how the simplest way to abolish poverty is the most direct. And I start there because for me, I just don't see the function, the value, or the benefit of poverty in the 21st century or civilized society. I don't see who wins. I don't see how we're better. I don't see how that helps us live up to our values. So we piloted the idea of a guaranteed income, understanding that cities can't do a universal basic income program or even a guaranteed income program at massive scale because cities have to balance budgets. The only form of government, the only part of our government that can actually deficit spend is our federal government. But we also knew that did not absolve us of doing nothing. We couldn't just point the finger, but we had to use our city as a laboratory for democracy and really provide data and evidence and anecdotes to speak to why a guaranteed income is an important part of a conversation about the social safety net. And then COVID-19 happened after a year of the pilot, and we saw how no matter how hard people were working, if your job is closed, you can't go to work. No matter how much you want to work, if the doctor says 2 weeks at home, you have to stay at home and you don't have paid time off. No matter, and we saw just how the economy just wasn't working for working people. And we also saw, we've had this conversation the past year about how particularly women who do domestic work, caregiving work, childcare work, do it at home and uncompensated, but that is truly work. So we started Mayors for a Guaranteed Income. And then this year, the findings came out from the first year, which is 2019, because we gave 125 residents, all who lived in a census tract that was at or below the city's median, which means 75% of the city qualified. We gave them 125 people, $500 a month for 2 years on debit cards. And what we found after 1 year is really three things. Number one, that and please turn up the volume on this, folks. The guaranteed income actually allowed people to transition from part-time work to full-time work, meaning that those who received the guaranteed income worked more. And not that, in my opinion, work in and of itself isn't a vice or a virtue, but for a lot of people, there's this notion that we don't want to give people money because people won't work. The data doesn't say that's true. The data says actually the $500 was enough to serve as a bridge to opportunity. So folks were able to take time off their part-time job and apply for full-time jobs, buy clothes for interviews, get their cars fixed. The second big finding was around what people spent their money on. 98% of the dollars went to non-drugs and non-alcohol. The money went to how you and I spend money, Mayor. The money went to utilities, went to food, went to children, went to sort of one-time expenses that were very debilitative. And then the third thing we found is that actually the guaranteed income had impacts on health, that folks received the guaranteed income on the Kessler scale moved from depressed to not depressed. They were less stressed, less anxious, and more able to be present as parents, as partners, and as neighbors. So as you can tell, I'm through the moon. Since then, we've started Mayors for a Guaranteed Income. I'm excited to see on my Twitter feed that you have also joined. So now we're up to about 46 mayors from across this country who are saying, look, the status quo isn't working. As mayors, we have a mandate to do something for our people. And let's test, let's pilot. And then once we have the data, let's move to policy so that everyone has an income floor in our country.
Yeah, that's it's an amazing story, and the findings really run contrary to public perception. I think that's one of the things that's so exciting about what was reported from your city was that it ran against conventional thought, and it makes sense when you think about it that if you help people deal with being able to have food security and a sense of security of place, so they're going to be able to pay their utilities, they're not going to be able to be evicted, then of course they can go back to school. If they can pay their child care bills, then of course they can perhaps get a better job or move from part-time employment to full-time employment. This is. But the data nonetheless shows this. And one of the reasons that you were able to collect the data, and I think you should tell our viewers a little bit about it, is that that the way it worked in Stockton was you had sort of two groups. You had a control group, and you had another group that was given debit cards. And then the spending on those debit cards was able to be sort of tracked. So that, but tell us a little bit more just about practically how did you do it, and how did you determine some of the difficult choices, like who was going to be able to participate, amidst so much need?
Yeah, and luckily for me, just like you, I had an amazing team. I'm starting with our evaluators who now run the Center for Guaranteed Income Research. We started at UPenn, and others. And essentially, we did a community sort of listening and engagement process because, again, this was in 2017. So there were 0 mayors for a guaranteed income. There were 0 guaranteed income pilots being led by cities. The whole idea was so new and foreign to people. So we spent a year in a community design process, which had an advisory group of community members, some who were supportive, some who weren't, who really went on this learning journey with us. And I listened to folks in the community, and we found that people realized that we weren't able to help everyone, but they wanted at least a process, at least in Stockton, to feel like everyone had a chance to be a part. And that's why our criterion was live at or below the city's median income, because that meant 75% of the city qualified. But other than that, there was no other requirements. We sent letters out to addresses, not to names, and whoever got the mail was able to decide who in the family or the household was able to participate in the study. And then we also did a control group because we thought it was also important to show sort of comparatively these two groups of these two groups of people started identical on paper in terms of race, ethnicity, income levels, education levels, etc., and see the drastic difference after just 1 year, with the only sort of measurable change being one group received $500 a month and one group didn't. So the control group was of 500 folks, and they did surveys, they shared their spending data, and were able to compare that way. And then we used debit cards because we knew that one of the questions people wanted to know was how the money was spent. But we were very clear with our participants that they weren't used in a punitive way to look at, like the only one that had access to that data was our researchers, A. But B, they didn't report it at an individual level, but at the aggregate level. In terms of this is what the whole body of folks did to really protect people's privacy. Because a big part of this demonstration for me wasn't just the data, but it was really proving A, you can trust people, and B, giving people the dignity and the agency to make decisions for themselves and their families, and not feeling too Orwellian or Big Brother-ish in terms of looking at and tracking or looking at every single purchase myself or the rest of the team that wasn't the researchers.
Sure. Sure, but the results have just been they've been phenomenal, and they show the importance of a program like this and how it might work. Let me just say from your program in Stockton was privately funded. It was foundation funded, and we're looking in Harrisburg to take advantage of the current moment, which is the American Rescue Plan, which has been passed by the Biden administration, and which is going to provide direct funding to cities like Harrisburg, and opens up a real opportunity for a sustained multi-year program, especially as the guidelines are being written for that, and there's going to be payment over multiple years. And the question, I guess, now is it's sort of twofold. One is, why now? And you could argue that for sure, one of the reasons is that the wealth disparity in Harrisburg and throughout the country has only been further exacerbated by COVID. And, if we are going to bounce back from COVID, we've got to make sure that everyone bounces back, and we've got to look at addressing these basic systemic issues. And then number two, we need to take advantage of federal policy, which is providing resources and providing funds to cities which have historically been disinvested in, and seize this moment to do something big and bold. I saw that Eric Garcetti in Los Angeles who's somebody that I've admired for a long time, is doing a program in Los Angeles for 2,000 families, and I thought to myself, well, that's Los Angeles. 2,000 families in a city of millions of people is one thing, but in Harrisburg, we're a small city. We're actually smaller than Stockton, and if we could help 2,000 families, it would be truly transformative. So, what are you seeing as the head of this mayor's group across the country? What are you seeing in terms of various approaches, and how is the discussion really coming to the forefront now as cities are going to be receiving funds from the American Rescue Plan?
It's really amazing the way the mayors have taken the baton and sprinted with it. So actually in August, Mayor Melvin Carter, when the co-chairs with Eric Garcetti of Mayors for Guaranteed Income of St. Paul, he said in 2000, when Trump was still president, I'm using some of these American Rescue Plan dollars to do a guaranteed income for families in St. Paul. And I think he was the first mayor to use sort of public funds to do so. And since then, we've had Garcetti and others saying, okay, this is the moment, this is the time, not to be bold for boldness sake, but because we've seen how the former status quo just left us woefully unprepared for a pandemic. And it just wasn't working. It hadn't worked, and it has to change. And I think to your point raised earlier about Dr. Hinton's book, so much of the Black Lives Matter protests we've seen weren't just about police brutality, in my opinion. They were also about just the violence of poverty,
Right.
the violence of a lack of opportunity. And I think a guaranteed income, particularly given its roots in the civil rights tradition, with Dr. King, the National Welfare Organization, the Black Panthers, and others calling for it, is something that meets those demands as well, in terms of the right to live and exist in this democracy and to live with dignity and with the ability to provide for basics. So I am through the moon and excited. And I think to your point, if we would did 2,000 people in Stockton, it would have been transformational. And I think for the city, it's the most important investment that you can make. And we have a once in a generation opportunity. This is our New Deal moment. When we look at our existing social safety net, we think of Social Security, we think of unemployment insurance. Those were all radical ideas in 1930. Those did not exist before the Great Depression. But leaders saw what was missing and acted on it. And I think in the same way, mayors like yourself and even the federal government with the child tax credit, which is a guaranteed income for families, are really leaning in and saying, how do we not just bounce back, but how do we bounce forward and continue to move and progress on our path to becoming a more perfect union?
Yeah, well, look, I couldn't agree more. And one of the interesting things, and we'll return to Dr. Hinton's book, America on Fire, again, which is coming out here on May 18th, is that we knew it. Communities knew it in 1969. Not only had Dr. King, literally gone to bat for the concept of a guaranteed income, but if you look at the Human Relations Commission that formed after the rebellions in Harrisburg or around the country, it was a moment when people recognized that if we were going to deal with issues of systemic racism and police brutality, we needed to address poverty, and we didn't. And the legacy of the past 50 years has unfortunately not been progress on that front. In fact, the wealth disparities are greater than ever, right? And the COVID has now almost exacerbated to the point where we have an eviction moratorium in place in Harrisburg that can't go on forever. But the fear is that if it's lifted, hundreds and hundreds of people would lose their homes. So how do we provide them with a measure of security? How do we get past COVID without leaving people behind? We've got to think about issues such as a guaranteed income. So Mayor Tubbs, thank you so much. I'm pleased to be a member of your organization. We're going to do this here in Harrisburg. We're going to utilize our friends at the University of Pennsylvania to help us shape this program, and we're going to lead the charge moving forward. And Moment, I'll just turn it over to you before we go to our other guests. And I know Mayor Tubbs has to go. Do we have any questions from our Facebook audience?
Yes, thank you, Mayor. We have a comment. Let's see. Let me bring that up here. Connie is excited about the book, first of all. And as far as questions, there's a question about the recurring payments aspect of the guaranteed income. Are those payments for a certain limited time, or is it kind of an ongoing, indefinite amount of recurring payments?
Well, ideally, once it's a policy and not a pilot, it would be sort of ongoing. And we've heard sort of from members of Congress saying, let's make the child tax credit permanent, which would be a monthly reoccurring cash payment to families with children. And that is the closest I think we are to a guaranteed income policy. But in terms of what cities are doing to test case is saying, hey, with the resources that we have and we can spend, let's do 1 year, let's do 2 years, let's do 3 years.
Yeah, and that's what we do here in Harrisburg Moment. We do more than a year. We do at least 2 years, and we have the resources to do it. It's really a once in a generation opportunity. We've never had such resources coming to Harrisburg. Mayor Tubbs, Harrisburg's got $48 million coming through the American Rescue Plan. Of course, there are a lot of needs, but that is enough in a small city like ours, much smaller than Stockton, to make all the difference in people's lives.
$85 million.
Yeah.
Which is remarkable.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Next, regarding low-income families, that income threshold, right? Like who can receive the payments? Do you have any thoughts of what that income threshold should be, or should it basically change based on the city?
I think the federal government has laid down the marker. I think they said 75K or below for individual, which in Stockton would be 75K is like 20K or 30K above
Yeah,
the median household income. So I think there's a number there depending on resources. I am someone I oftentimes get in trouble for it, but I think those who need the most help should get the most help and should be first in line for help. So I would say, I think Dr. Palmer calls it a preferential option for the poor. And I would say sort of ensuring that those who absolutely need it get it first. And then if there's room, adding on others who may need it at varying degrees would be my philosophy. But every city is going about it differently.
Yeah, yeah. And in Harrisburg, of course, we have we know what the median household income is. We have the numbers from HUD, but yeah, we actually have a higher poverty rate than Stockton, and we and if you do what Mayor Tubbs did, and you include those that are living, sort of around the poverty line, then you're looking at the majority of the population, which is pretty extraordinary. So the need is absolutely there. The question of where we draw the line, well, that's going to have to be part of the public discussion moving forward. But the resources are there to help thousands of families, and in a community like Harrisburg, that could be extraordinary.
And I think we have time for one more question. Mayor Tubbs, as far as what was the biggest surprise for you, with this whole program and pilot, or a surprise that you saw in Stockton or that you've heard from other mayors?
In terms of the results, it's not because I'm like Miss Cleo or clairvoyant, but I just know a lot of people who struggle. Like I grew up in poverty. Like most of my friends, I wasn't surprised that people knew how to spend money. I was not surprised people went to work. So I just thought of the people who raised me and the people who are my friends and family. And I was like, yeah, they're not going to spend all this money on drugs and alcohol. So I wasn't surprised at that. I was surprised at how so many people would rather cling to bias than data. Like even with the data being out, I'm still arguing with folks about skip what the data says. I believe because I've been taught or I have these biases. And that for me has been a surprise. So spending a lot of time now thinking about, in addition to the data, how do we tell a different story? How do we message it? How do we allow people to see what's real and what's reality versus what's biased, and oftentimes what's racist, what's just not true or what's not really grounded in fact. And that's going to be a long journey, but that's what I'm excited about digging into now.
All right, great, thanks.
Well, listen, thank you, Mayor Tubbs, for sharing your story. Thank you for the work that you're doing throughout the country. Look forward to staying in touch with you and learning from the Stockton experiment. It's an incredible moment that we're in now, and I think if mayors especially step up and take the lead, we can change the face of America, and we can do great, bold things. So, thanks for joining us.
Here, Mayor. So anything I can do to help, please let me know. And congratulations, Harrisburg, for having such a visionary, forward-thinking, and intelligent mayor.
Thanks.